Welcome to the Still Curtain podcast. It's Monday, June 30th, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are under a month away from reporting to Latrobe for training camp, and Omar Khan is still making major moves. I'm Josh Yourish, and today I'm going to be diving right into the Minkah Fitzpatrick for Jalen Ramsey blockbuster trade and what it means for the Pittsburgh Steelers this upcoming 2025 season. Obviously, a lot of big moves this offseason. This certainly feels like the biggest of the bunch for the Steelers. The DK Metcalf trade, signing Aaron Rodgers, trading George Pickens. And aside from that Pickens trade, which is, moving draft capital into next year's draft, which is part of the Steelers' seeming strategy to get a long-term answer at quarterback, the Steelers appear to be going all in to attempt to, if not win a Super Bowl in 2025 this upcoming season, win a playoff game and end Mike Tomlin's playoff win drought that has been lengthy, to say the least. So let's get into the deal. The trade, the Steelers get Jalen Ramsey, three-time All-Pro cornerback Jalen Ramsey, Jonnu Smith, coming off of a career year, tight end from Miami, and a 2027 seventh-round pick. The Dolphins get in exchange Minkah Fitzpatrick, also a three-time All-Pro, and a 2027 fifth-round pick. The Jonnu Smith and late-round pick swaps were kind of thrown in as almost a separate deal, but it makes more sense to just lump it together as one. Ultimately, Minkah Fitzpatrick for Jalen Ramsey is the conversation, is the jumping off point. Who got the better player? What player makes sense for what franchise? And ultimately, it feels like both teams got a little bit of what they wanted in this deal. And that's revealed when you look a little bit closer at the contracts. Jalen Ramsey in 2026 will make $26 million. He turns 31 in October. He is under contract through 2028. He wanted to get out of Miami. Miami wanted to get him out of there. Miami is a franchise that is looking to get off many of their expensive veteran contracts and try to look to build for the future. And what that says for Mike McDaniel's job security or anything like that is a different story for a different show, not the Still Curtain podcast. For the Steelers and for Miami, rather, in that goal, with that goal in mind, Minkah Fitzpatrick in 2026 will make $15.5 million. He is under contract through 2026, so the season after next, but that's non-guaranteed. So the Dolphins can essentially look at this as a one-year rental for Fitzpatrick to stabilize the back end of their defense, the secondary that needs stabilizing after Joanne Holland left in free agency. And the Steelers can look at Ramsey as a solution at cornerback that they've needed, a long-term fit potentially in an aging secondary, and a versatile chess piece at a more important position. So Ramsey has positional versatility. He can start outside opposite JPJ. The Steelers need a lot from Joey Porter Jr. They're banking on a lot from Joey Porter Jr. in his third season now because it felt like he took a step back in year two, but now he can be cornerback two. Maybe at times even seemingly quarterback three with Darius Slay, who the Steelers also signed to a one-year, $10 million contract, the 34-year-old cornerback who played with the Philadelphia Eagles last season. They also signed him this offseason. So that's an aging cornerback group with Ramsey and with Slay, but a really talented one, because how I and many are beginning to speculate that things will likely work for Tomlin and Terrell Austin on the Steelers defense. Ramsey and JPJ on the outside in base. And then when you go to sub package, when you go to nickel and bring an extra defensive back on, Ramsey can then slide into the slot. You have Slay and Joey Porter Jr. on the outside. Ramsey has done a lot in the slot throughout his career. he really took off in that role once he got moved to the Rams, and played with LA, midway through his contract. In 2021 was his peak slot usage, but it was kind of that star position that Brandon Staley kind of popularized. And with Ramsey's size and his big body, his tackling ability, he can play around the line of scrimmage. He can play in the box. I mean, he could be an excellent safety if the Steelers wanted to use him there, but that swap wouldn't really make sense to move Ramsey to an unfamiliar position, be locked into that contract longer term, and move off of one of the league's best safeties, even though we'll get into if Minkah Fitzpatrick is truly declining or if it was just a role thing, which, a role issue is ultimately what brought Minkah to Pittsburgh in the first place. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but Ramsey can play the slot. He played 185 snaps in the slot last year, 728, the vast majority at boundary corner. But he also played 33 snaps on the edge and 80 snaps in the box, 1 snap at free safety. In that 2021 season, his peak usage in the slot, he played 341 slot snaps, 153 in the box and 31 on the edge, along with 737 at corner. Last season was the first for Ramsey that he didn't make a Pro Bowl, whatever we want to say a Pro Bowl's worth, since 2019. So that's something that could potentially be an issue and point to decline, but he's not a player in steep decline, especially not the way the Steelers and the league seem to value him with that large contract, the contract that the Dolphins recently gave him. They gave him last offseason. And Ramsey played 17 games last year. So health isn't really a concern. It hasn't been much of a concern through much of his career. He's been a very durable player. I just mentioned those lofty snap counts. So the Steelers, from purely, if you're not evaluating the players specifically and just looking at this purely through the lens of positional value, the Steelers upgraded, right? If you have the best safety and the best corner, the best corner gets paid more. The best corner is more valuable in the NFL. So making this swap, if you're saying they're equivalent players, which I would argue that Minkah is more clearly in decline than Ramsey, then the Steelers are already up. And that's because Miami is trying to get off of long-term money and trying to reset themselves a little bit as a franchise. The Steelers are going all in. So they win on the positional value, but in my opinion, they also win on the value of the player specifically. I think Ramsey is still capable of absolutely being that lockdown corner. And though his contract runs through 2028 when he'll be in his age 34 season, and that is definitely concerning for a player who turns 31 this October, he can ultimately slide to safety and you can feel comfortable about it. You can ultimately get out of that deal with the dead cap hit in the 2028 season would just be $7.5 million on a $31 million cap hit. So you could save a whole heck of a lot there. If you are ready to move off of Ramsey at that point, you could even move off of him a year earlier to save $9 million on the cap with an $11 million cap hit. So it's not a deal that's so prohibitive, especially for a player that I think can age into a physical tackling safety role, especially with what he's shown in the star role in LA, in slot usage in Miami, and even before throughout his career, because this has been one of the best defensive backs in the NFL for a really long time. The really long time part is the scary part, but a lot of the best players on the Steelers have been really good at their positions for a very long time because this is an aging roster, and the Steelers are very clear about picking a direction at this point, right? They're going to be going all in as you can be with Aaron Rodgers as your quarterback heading into his age 41 season. So even a decade older than Ramsey. The last couple things on the fit, and I'm sure we'll circle around to this more, like Deshaun Elliott, and this segues somewhat into the Minkah conversation. Deshaun Elliott and Juan Thornhill will likely be the Steelers starters at safety this year. Juan Thornhill was a free agent pickup that was kind of seemed odd. Just a bit of a journeyman defensive back, but now is going to be a very useful player and a player that they rely upon a lot. Whatever Thornhill will be, he's been reliable in limited roles in the past. Whatever Thornhill will be, it's better to have a weakness at safety than it is at cornerback. It's easier. That's an easier weakness to cover up. And at the other safety spot, I don't think the Steelers will have a weakness or do have a weakness because another former Dolphin, Deshaun Elliott, was excellent last season. And in my opinion, was the much better player between the two safeties, between Minkah and himself. Elliott was physical, flying all over the field, and just popped. Really popped when you watch the games initially, and then when you go back and watch them later and try to break things down. Elliott popped in a lot of ways, in coverage, in run defense, just closing off angles. Now, the question is, was he that caliber of player because of the role that Minkah Fitzpatrick played? So, Minkah began his career coming to Pittsburgh because he was unhappy, largely because he was unhappy with his role in Miami. They were using him as a nickel and as a corner and as a safety, much how Nick Saban used him in Alabama, where he was, a two-time All-American and two-time national champion. And Fitzpatrick wasn't happy with that role. Miami was tearing it down to the studs in the first year with Brian Flores, trying to tank for Tua, who they ultimately got despite not executing the tank as well as many would have thought looking at that roster. Minkah comes to Pittsburgh, is a pure ball hawking free safety, and rescues a season when the Steelers should have themselves been tanking after Ben Roethlisberger injured his elbow and was out for the season. And from that point, Minkah was a first-team All-Pro candidate or the first-team All-Pro safety, free safety every year. He was one of the most fearsome ball hawks in the NFL. And then over the last two seasons, that's just not been the case at all. He's had one interception across the last two seasons. It came late last year. Part of that is because of an evolving role. In 2023, that role was more in the box and as a reliable tackler, and the only reliable second-level tackler that the Steelers had in the run game, really, because they had such a glaring weakness at linebacker. So it brought Minkah into the box a lot more that season. And didn't allow him to play free safety quite as much. And then last season, he was in the box as well, but when he was at free safety, he was deep. He was a very deep free safety. Looking at snap counts is why I slowed up a little bit. Minkah's box number of snaps in the box last season was actually higher than the season before, but the percentage was much lower because Minkah didn't play nearly as many snaps in 2023 as he did in 2024 with better health. So that slowed me up for a second, but yes, it was in the box a lot more in 2023, around the line of scrimmage a lot more in 2023, and that had to do with the structural issues that the Steelers had on defense. Last year, they signed Patrick Queen, and Minkah can move back to free safety. But he kind of became this just very, very deep center field free safety that, as the NFL this past season continued its movement more towards two deep safety looks, either cover 2, cover 4, the Steelers stayed in a lot more cover 3, and that's just a Mike Tomlin preference lately in his career. He began as a Tampa 2 guy, but he's been more of, him and Terrell Austin have been more cover 3. And Minkah, in some ways, because the ground he can cover back there, which is a very valuable skill, was the Steelers' own one-man, two deep safety look. And the Steelers weren't getting shredded deep. right? I don't, it was not a situation. He was still able to deter teams from throwing deep, especially deep down the middle of the field. Which is valuable because it allows you to up the box count. It allows you to have Elliott more in the mix, more flying around, right? That's part of why Elliott had such a good season last year. But in my opinion, Elliott's just a really good player. And even as his role adjusts, I don't see that changing. I think the bigger concern is about what Minkah still has left to give. And that's no longer a concern for the Steelers, which is another reason I like this deal a lot. A lot is strong because I have questions about the overall philosophy of going all in. I have questions about, but picking a direction is something I've been begging the Steelers to do, and they're clearly doing it. So I can't really fault them for that because a viable direction is, trying to go up or trying to go down. They've chosen up. Okay, let's see how it works out. I question the viability of that with Aaron Rodgers. But moving off of Minkah Fitzpatrick and getting a player like Jalen Ramsey for him is, in my opinion, an upgrade for the Steelers defense. So is it a role thing with Minkah, or is he losing a step, right? Even if you lose a half step when you're trying to cover so much ground deep in the secondary, are you the same center field ball hawk that you once were, that once was an all-pro, that once, helped Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges lead the Steelers to, staying above 500? It's difficult to say. I think we'll get the answer this year in Miami, right? Anthony Weaver is an up-and-coming defensive coordinator there. For whatever trajectory Mike McDaniel's on, there are things to feel good about schematically with the Dolphins defense, getting the most out of lesser talent, and they're certainly going to have lesser talent down there. So it'll be interesting to see how he's deployed compared to how Tomlin and Austin were deploying him, and if Weaver can get more out of Minkah, because I don't think the Steelers could. I think the Steelers needed to move Minkah into a more around the line of scrimmage role in 2023. They did it because it was the only thing they could do to shore up their tackling in the second level. And Minkah, to his credit, did a great job. Was a prolific tackler that year. Last season, the idea was you bring in Patrick Queen, you bring in Deshaun Elliott, Minkah can go back to center field, he can be a ball hawk again. And he went back to center field and he just wasn't. So in my eyes, that's a reflection on the player more than it is on the usage. But we'll get the ultimate answer next season. I like the Steelers taking the bet on a player at a more valuable position, just an inherently more valuable position with cornerback, and a player that I don't think is on the same level of decline as the Steelers have seen for Minkah. So as a one-for-one swap, each team's getting what they want. Miami's getting more financial flexibility. The Steelers are getting a player who, in my opinion, raises the ceiling of the most expensive defense in the NFL and one of the oldest defenses in the NFL, because that defense needs to be one of the best in the league for the Steelers to win now. So I think that one-for-one swap satisfies a lot of needs. It is a sensible fit for the Steelers because Beanie Bishop, for as exciting as he was and the multiple interceptions, there were questions there that I had more questions than maybe most about what Bishop was going to be in year 2 in the nickel. You don't have to worry about that as much. I had questions about how Darius Slay was going to hold up in his age 34 season. You don't have to worry about that quite as much. Like, this just improves the depth at corner. It means there are less weak spots for opposing offenses to pick on. And yeah, there might be a drop off in the deep secondary with the safety play, but Deshaun Elliott showed me enough last year to believe it'll be certainly serviceable, if not better than that. I'm excited about this move. I'm intrigued. I'm as intrigued going into a Steelers season as I've been in a while. Like probably since 2020, Ben coming off the injury. What's that going to look like? Is there anything left here? That was intriguing to me once we realized there was nothing there. Then, okay, yeah, Kenny Pickett brought some intrigue, but I felt like that team was pretty clearly going to be capped. And he was a quarterback that ultimately I bought in on as letting my fandom take over, but the league was not very excited about, and the Steelers were banking on being the lone NFL quarterback in one of the weakest quarterback drafts in NFL history. And he just wasn't. And it felt like just trying to Indiana Jones swap out the idol for the bag of sand, right? Just keep mostly everything the same and Ben for Kenny. This is radically different for how the Steelers are operating, right? This is probably the biggest trade in franchise history. Two players who are potential future Hall of Famers, both three-time first-team All-Pros, being swapped one for one. It's a unique trade in the NFL in general. Player-for-player trades like this do not happen. The Steelers certainly do not make them, right? Prior to that, maybe the biggest trade was a first-round pick, sending a first-round pick to Miami for Minkah. That's intriguing. That's exciting. I don't think this team can win a Super Bowl. I don't think, as long as Mike Tomlin is still the coach in Pittsburgh, that the Steelers will be able to win multiple playoff games. Because I think there is a serious cap on his schematic advantages or disadvantages, a cap placed on the roster by the schematic disadvantages that Tomlin puts his team at with his overprotective offensive philosophies and the handcuffs he puts on his offensive play callers and a lot of the outdated scheme stuff that he does defensively that gets destroyed in the playoffs. So I have my trepidations. Absolutely. But the Steelers are picking a direction, and I'm excited about that. So let's take a look at the other pieces here. On defense, before we get to the offensive part of this trade, on defense, TJ Watt turns 31 in October. He did not show up at mandatory minicamp. He is going to likely be holding out or holding in training camp until he gets a deal done. He's heading into the final year of his contract. He wants to be paid and reset the edge market that was just reset by Myles Garrett. He wants to be the highest paid defensive player in NFL history. On his prior work, he's probably earned that distinction. On his most recent efforts, maybe not so much. But now that you make this move, you further declared yourself all in, as you did with the DK Metcalf trade, as you did with signing Aaron Rodgers. You have to pay TJ Watt now. And TJ Watt knows this. So TJ Watt can make sure he's getting paid like the best defensive player in the NFL, the most valuable defensive player in the NFL. And at this point in his career, he's certainly, to me, not the most valuable defensive player in the NFL. As this contract discussion, dispute, whatever you want to call it, continues to drag out, Watt knows that the Steelers are going to be sweating more than he is, especially after this trade. And considering the fact that your best defensive players are Cam Hayward, Jalen Ramsey, and TJ Watt, and you're tied into Ramsey through 2028, but at least through 2026, if you're willing to stomach the dead cap in 27 and 28, that's manageable. Then you may as well pay TJ Watt. What would be the point of doing both? What would be the point of making this trade? If you're worried about money into the future, you would have just run it back with Minkah this year, got off the non-guaranteed year in 2026, tried to start resetting the books defensively. You're not worried about that. That's what Omar Khan's saying with this trade. He's not worried about that long-term outlook on the defense. He's not worried about the defense aging. He's looking to win now with this team. So then you pay TJ Watt. And I don't think ultimately going this all in on such an aging roster with an aging quarterback who was in legitimate decline last year, there are reasons for hope that he'll bounce back, but I don't have much hope. There are plenty of reasons to say this is flawed team building, flawed philosophy, flawed roster construction, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And there are reasons to feel a little bit more comfortable about it that I'm taking solace in personally. I'm excited and intrigued to watch and cover this season. So divorcing myself from the fandom of it, let's go. Allowing the fandom to creep in and the feelings of I want my team to be not just winning on Sundays, but set up to win a Super Bowl. I'm taking solace in the fact that while the Steelers are not doing the 2 timeline thing that does not work, the 1 foot in each door that does not work, the trying to satisfy the future and also the present at the same time, they've picked a direction. They're going all in, but they haven't cut out their safety net. And there's a good example of this in the NBA recently of a team. It's a bit of a different situation, but a team with big question marks for different reasons, not quite an aging team, but the New Orleans Pelicans. I don't know if many Steelers fans follow the NBA, and maybe you'll stop listening right now, but I promise I'll quickly bring it back to the NFL. I'm not going to linger on this. They have Zion Williamson. He's a big injury risk, much like Aaron Rodgers might be. He could be one of the better players in the NBA if he's at his ceiling. Is rarely there, is rarely healthy. In this most recent draft, they drafted a point guard with their first-round pick, and then they traded up 10 spots from their second first-round pick. It was 23 to 13 to draft Derek Queen out of Maryland. In doing so, they gave up their next year unprotected first-round pick. Now, the mechanics of trades like that are a little different in the NBA and in the NFL, but essentially a team that could see its best player go out with an injury and suddenly tumble down to the bottom of the NBA and be in, especially with the lottery, which is one of the different mechanics, certainly have a shot at the number 1 pick next year. They just gave that pick away to move up 10 spots in the middle of the first round, not even to the top. The Steelers aren't doing that. They're all in, but the Steelers are all in, but they have a bunch of draft capital next year. Right? The Steelers are all in, but they traded George Pickens for a 3rd-round pick in next year's draft. But they signed Darius Slay as their big free agent addition because he was cut by the Eagles, so it doesn't hurt their comp pick formula. Steelers are all in, but they let Dan Moore walk to the Titans and are going to get a significant, probably 3rd-round comp pick for him. The Steelers are all in, but they have enough ammo in the war chest for next year to trade up in what's looking like it could be a loaded quarterback class and go get the long-term answer there. That's what I'm taking solace in. The Steelers have picked a direction, but they haven't cut off their safety net, right? They're now flying down the highway, but they didn't remove the guardrails. If this goes wrong, there are outs. And there are ways to go get a good young quarterback. There are ways to turn this roster over. I mentioned them with the Ramsey contract. Maybe not next year there's an out, but the year after. Picking a direction, which is what I've been harping on the Steelers needing to do since I started doing this podcast last summer. It isn't just important because you're guaranteed to head in that direction. It's just important because it gets you out of the middle. It almost always, maybe Mike Tomlin is the exception, gets you out of the middle. The Steelers are building an aging, expensive roster. They're leveraging themselves in these veteran players with a huge question mark at quarterback. Maybe that turns into an AFC Championship game appearance. I'm not willing to say maybe it turns into a Super Bowl because I just don't see that ceiling with this team and with this coaching staff. But maybe it turns into multiple playoff wins, something the Steelers have not had in years. Steelers have not had one playoff win in years. Maybe it turns into that. But maybe Rodgers gets hurt. Maybe Rodgers isn't good anymore. Maybe Cam Hayward finally falls off a cliff. Maybe Jalen Ramsey is losing a step. Then you still have the ammo and the capital to go get a quarterback next year. You have the flexibility to shed a lot of money with these veterans. You have a pretty young offense, especially built around a young offensive line. You have young key pieces on defense, Derek Harmon, Peyton Wilson, Joey Porter Jr. You haven't cut out the netting below, right? You've stepped out onto the tightrope of playoff contention, of heading in a Super Bowl direction, right? Because that's a scary thing to do. You have to take a leap of faith, not to mix metaphors, but you haven't cut out the safety net below, the trampoline below. If you fall, you can still catch yourself. It's not catastrophic. So I'm taking solace in that because I have concerns about what this roster ceiling is and ultimately what the point is if you don't see yourself as a Super Bowl contender and if you don't have one of those superhero quarterbacks in the AFC, the likes of Patrick Mahomes and, the big four, Mahomes, Allen, Jackson, and Burrow. It takes a lot to be in the mix with those teams without one of those guys. So I don't see any real path for the Steelers to get to the Super Bowl, even after this latest move. I didn't see it before. I don't see it now, even though I think the ceiling of this team is a little bit higher. But I'm okay with picking that direction because it could succeed or it could fail. But either way, it forces you out of the middle. So I'm happy with that. I am. I'm happy with that process from Omar Khan. He still has a path to a young quarterback. He still has and right now he maybe has a path to Super Bowl. Maybe. I'm not willing to actually say that's real. And maybe most importantly to me, someone who doesn't believe the Steelers will be able to succeed in the highest level as long as Mike Tomlin is still their head coach. Does this move in conjunction with those other moves that I've mentioned ad nauseum today put enough pressure on Mike Tomlin to win a playoff game that this could be a make or break season? I hesitate to say this with a franchise that's had 3 head coaches since 1969. I think so. I think that pressure is ultimately starting to mount. I think the Steelers would consider going in another direction if they don't win a playoff game with this team, if this blows up spectacularly. Because I think there's a lot of pressure, internal and external there. I think Tomlin is certainly one of the people who pushed for Aaron Rodgers. Eventually, when you push for Kenny Pickett, you push for Aaron Rodgers, you keep missing on quarterbacks. If that's what happens, you struggle to find that answer. Eventually, your name has to come up on the chopping block. So from all of those angles, I like this trade. I'm intrigued by this trade, and I'm really excited to see how things play out for the Steelers this season, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And before we get to the part of the move of this move on the offensive side of the ball and talk about Jonnu Smith a little bit, two things. First, if you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you enjoy me rambling on about the Pittsburgh Steelers, or Tommy Jagai and Shane Kubis on Wednesdays having potentially more coherent conversations about the Steelers, then like and subscribe to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. And speaking of the YouTube, we're live on YouTube. So jump in the chat. We have a couple people that have. Corey Beavers hops in the chat. I'm happy with this trade today because there's no reason to pay $18 million when they aren't producing, pay a safety $18 million when they aren't producing. Ramsey still plays above average cornerback play. We don't need to be elite at safety if our corners eat. Absolutely agree with that. That's the point I was getting to, Corey, with the positional value of it all. Ramsey is a more expensive player, but at a more valuable position, and also, in my opinion, is the better player of the two at this point in their careers. So the positional value, it's easier to hide a deficiency at safety. Juan Thornhill will likely be the worst player on the Steelers defense. If you're going to put a worse player somewhere in the modern NFL, putting him at safety is probably the best spot, probably your best bet. Certainly not a corner. We saw how that went. We've seen how that's gone with guys like Levi Wallace, or, further than that, Artie Burns, or other weaknesses the Steelers have had at corner. I don't think Darius Slay necessarily would have been that, but now corner is absolutely a strength. And the pressure, to Corey's point here, if the Steelers corners eat, the pressure is off Joey Porter Jr. a little bit. And that's something that's intriguing to me and exciting to me. He can be cornerback too. He can develop. He can learn from one of the best corners in the NFL. And hopefully that helps his development. Darwin Nolan hopping in the chat. Your football IQ is low. This is a Super Bowl team. My friend, I don't believe you've watched much Aaron Rodgers recently. I really don't. I think you might be looking at touchdown to interception ratios and not see how afraid he is to get hit, how quickly he's getting the ball out of his hands, how his throws over the middle are sailing because he's bailing out of clean pockets, how he's lacking creation ability. That was Rodgers' superpower, that he could generate so much velocity from any throwing platform. And that allowed him to make unreal throws outside of the pocket. Now he can't even get outside of the pocket, let alone create that velocity, right? His arm's still there when he's got a clean platform, but off-platform stuff is just not nearly the same. He's not nearly as accurate with it, and that limits his ceiling specifically as a quarterback. It limits all quarterbacks when they don't have that second reaction creation, but especially a guy like Rodgers, who has thrived off of that for his entire career. And Darwin Nolan again, some comments in the chat absolutely about the Steelers and Chuck Noll having losing seasons. And yes, the Steelers probably aren't going to move on from Tomlin. Deontay Jackson and Beanie Bishop were the weakest link last year. Yeah, and Beanie Bishop now won't be on the field, won't be as important of a piece because Ramsey is so good in the slot. And with Darius Slay can move in as the third corner on the outside. Porter Jr., opposite Porter Jr., and Ramsey can move into the nickel. I think that's going to be a really good fit, and it just cleans up a lot of the issues that the Steelers had in coverage last year, along with just getting more impactful players at important positions. So Moving on from the chat, continue to throw your messages in the chat. I'll get around to them and jump on them. I really appreciate that. I love that, especially for these reaction shows when there's big news. Getting the opinions of Steelers fans is what we want to do here. To the offensive side of the ball, this trade isn't just a 1-for-1 Minkah for Ramsey swap. Jonnu Smith is coming off of a career year. Miami last season was decimated by injuries, as they have been multiple seasons, but Smith became arguably the top target in Mike McDaniel's offense, and he was a unique fit, an interesting fit, I think, for McDaniel, like a uniquely successful one, in that he's such a good yards after the catch threat that McDaniel could get the ball out of his quarterback's hand, be it Tua or any number of backups when Tua is injured, and get it into Jonnu Smith's hands quickly and let him create after the catch. He finished the year with 88 catches for 884 yards and 8 touchdowns. That's a legit tight end season. That's an awesome tight end season. Some of that is out of necessity. Some of that is just Jonnu Smith's a good football player. And Arthur Smith loves him. He's reunited with Arthur Smith. He was with him in Atlanta in 2023, caught 50 passes for 582 yards and 3 touchdowns that season on a team that had Kyle Pitts as its tight end 1, maybe de facto draft capital tight end 1. I don't know that Smith ever really loved Pitts, and he's a polarizing player in NFL and fantasy and everything circles. But Jonnu Smith was able to produce on a team that had another high-volume tight end. That's important because the Steelers are going to be playing a lot of 2 tight end sets. And Smith was also with – Jonnu Smith was also with Arthur Smith in Tennessee. No relation. In Tennessee from 2017 to, until Arthur Smith left for the Falcons head coaching job. Smith turns 30. That's Jonnu Smith, turns 30 in August. So, again, getting up there a little bit, but coming off his best season. So, I'm not concerned about it. The Steelers traded for him with those late round swaps in 2027. Okay, sure. I think he's potentially a little bit more valuable than that, but Miami didn't want to pay him. So, the Steelers gave him a 1-year, $12 million contract extension, which, compared to the other options of what the Steelers could do, is a good move. And part of the idea of you don't have a franchise quarterback, you're not paying a quarterback franchise money, is you can skimp a little bit at other positions. And the Rodgers deal being $14+ million gives you the opportunity to pay up a little bit, pay a bit of a premium for a guy like Jonnu Smith to be your second tight end and fill a hole on the roster, because while the Steelers are really good at tight end with Freiermuth and Darnell Washington and now Jonnu Smith, they're really weak at wide receiver too. And that's a massive question mark between, Robert Woods, Calvin Austin III, Roman Wilson. What is that going to look like? Especially when the Steelers, run 11 personnel out there or even go empty or anything and have multiple wide receivers on the field. I just think they have better pass catching options at tight end. So it's going to be a lot of 12 next season. And I think that'll be one of the Steelers' most effective personnel groupings with either Jonnu or Darnell Washington. With those options, Smith he's going to be the yak guy, which kind of allows him to fill what role a slot receiver would have or will fill. Maybe Roman Wilson is still that guy, but that's an unknown at this point. So getting a guy who was 6th among tight ends last year in yards per route run, and 3rd behind Brock Bowers and Trey McBride in total yards after the catch among tight ends, He was even 7th in yards after the catch per reception among tight ends who saw at least 50 targets last season. That's just a really productive guy with the ball in his hands. And that's also important going back to what I just said about Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers had a career low time to throw last season and one of the lowest average depths of target of his career. He's getting the ball out. Remember Big Ben at the end? Do we remember Ben in 2020 and 2021 when he couldn't move, when he didn't want to get hit, when he sat in shotgun, got the ball out of his hands quick? That's going to be a lot of what this Aaron Rodgers offense has to be. So getting a player like Jonnu Smith is a really good fit for that. He's good on screens. Like tight end screens are something the Steelers like to do with Arthur Smith. I felt like they started 3 separate games with the hard play action boot into Darnell Washington in the flare rumble for 13 yards. Jonnu Smith can do that. And while he's not the physical imposing threat that Darnell Washington is, he's much more athletic. He can make tacklers miss. I'm into this move. I'm into this being an addition to the trade because it feels like that's what it feels like, an addition, right? Jonnu Smith forced 13 missed tackles last year. That was 4th among tight ends in the NFL. That's a good fit. He's going to be a receiver that Aaron Rodgers loves because of that. So this is not just the 1-for-1 trade. Getting Jonnu Smith for that pick swap, being willing to pay him and being able to pay him because you have a relatively cheap quarterback is what the Steelers have to try to do to maximize this window when they aren't paying a franchise quarterback. And that'll continue to be the case once they draft one, and he's cheap as well. So I like the impact on the offensive side of the ball. Continuing to the last thing to really spin it forward, right? 2 last things, I guess, and Darwin Nolan in the chat again. Got to it a little bit before me, but totally agree. Khan will add a possession wide receiver too. Calvin Austin will have a monster year with Aaron Rodgers, and Roman Wilson will contribute also. Need to gather as much talent as possible. I absolutely agree. The Steelers need to add another weapon on top of the Robert Woods addition. Maybe it's Gabe Davis, who is likely going to make a decision closer to training camp. Maybe it's Tyler Boyd, who just talked to Austin Bechtold of Pittsburgh Sports Now and 93.7 The Fan about wanting to join the Steelers finally in his career, something that Steelers fans have certainly talked about for a long time, and the Pitt fans, Steelers fans, certainly. I don't think the Steelers are done. And I do think they being Omar Khan, Andy Weidel, the decision makers in the front office, have significantly improved this roster with really creative moves. A series of really creative and un-Steelers-like moves. They've chosen a direction, they've gone all in, and they should continue to add as much as they can to prepare for that attrition that Darwin just mentioned in the chat. And to prepare for the possibility of maybe Calvin Austin not having a monster year, or Roman Wilson not adapting in year 2 after getting the slow start in year 1 and essentially redshirting. So keep an eye out for a potential another move at wide receiver, but this protects the Steelers from having to make one, from having to reach to make one, from needing to give up draft capital to make one. I think the Jonnu Smith aspect of this trade protects against that. And then the last thing from me on this trade is I'm nearing an hour on this blockbuster, but it certainly deserves it, especially at this point in the offseason. 2 players that are going to be absolutely at risk on the Steelers roster now, Connor Hayward and Corey Trice. Hayward, if you're the 4th tight end, you better be a very good fullback and you better have an offensive coordinator who wants to use one. And I really don't see that being the case for Arthur Smith. So I think this is going to be a massive training camp for Connor Hayward, and I think he's probably going to end up being a casualty at the end of it. And then Corey Trice, who got some work last year as a depth cornerback. The Steelers brought in Brandon Echols this offseason as a depth corner. Now you add Ramsey, you have Beanie Bishop. If Trice is going to be CB4, CB5, you better have a big role on special teams. And he can potentially develop into a special teamer. We haven't seen a ton of it from Trice. And I think with his build, he's not particularly the ideal gunner. So if he can develop into that, then he'll probably find his way onto the roster. If not, he could be one that is on the chopping block as well at the end of training camp. So that'll do it for me today. A lot of intrigue with this trade. Really exciting move, intriguing move. I've said that word a million times today, and I'm getting annoyed at myself for doing it. But that's how I feel about this Steelers season. I'm dying to see what this roster ultimately ends up looking like on week 1 and what it can do. I don't see it being a Super Bowl team, but I see it being a team that can and almost has to win a playoff game. So the pressure is going to be on Mike Tomlin, and that'll be fun to watch and see how he responds. That'll do it for me this week. Hopping back on after a slow June, not many shows for me. But until next time, I'm happy to do it today with some big news. And until next time, as always, go Steelers.